Well, welcome back to part two of this Passover presentation. It's called A New Moses, A New Passover, and A New Exodus. One of the themes in this session here is the idea of the inauguration of the Exodus connected to the bread of the world to come. We'll talk about that more as we go through talking about the manna and the bread of the presence. A reminder here that it's not just about remembering and rehearsing and doing it as it is, that the actual eating of the bread and, of course, the Passover lamb is an act of worship. It's taking us an act of worship to come into the presence of God. So it turns out in the first century here, there was a strong Jewish belief in the return of the manna circulating. This at the time of Yeshua. This is found in the Babylonian Talmud and Second Baruch, I think. Matthew 4:4, we had talked about in our last session. Yeshua is dealing with the adversary in the wilderness, this conflict here. And the response, of course, the adversary is saying, if you are God, if you are the Ben Elohim, if you're the Son of God, then command these stones to become bread. And Yeshua's response is, "It is written," referring back to Moses, the tablets of stone. When Moses was on the mountain, he was there also with the elders and Aaron, high priest, and his sons, and they were eating. And that the act of eating and drinking and seeing God. So there's a connection there between this eating and worship and being in the presence of God. Of course, Yeshua responds, "It's written, man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God," is the response that he gives to the adversary when they're out in the wilderness. Now, Passover, obviously, is a meal. Many of you celebrate each year. And typically in the ancient world, a meal was the ratification of a covenant. So a covenant would be made, a meal would seal the deal. And that meal would obviously include bread and wine. So the Passover, if we go back to the Exodus Passover in the book of Exodus, the Passover basically sets the Exodus in motion. And so how does it begin? It begins with a sacrificial offering of the Paschal lamb. But the Paschal lamb had to be eaten before they were going anywhere, before they could leave Egypt. So the lamb was eaten, again, not just as a memorial or a remembrance, but actual eating. And that's the whole point here. So when we get to the New Testament, the Last Supper is instituting a new Passover, not just memorializing the old, which there's nothing wrong with that, I'm saying, but what is it in the New Testament? Where are we to take this? How are we to see it? Yeshua is basically establishing a new Exodus, if you will. He is inaugurating a new Exodus. He spoke of his departure, his Exodus, in Luke 9, 28, 31 through 31 in there. And he's going to be speaking of his resurrection, his departure. Yeshua has placed his body as the bread and his blood as the wine at the very center of this new Passover. So again, the meal is going to ratify the covenant, and it will be offered up to inaugurate a new Exodus, a new Passover with a new Moses. And of course, as I mentioned, that the Passover was not complete until the flesh of the lamb was eaten. So the New Testament celebration of this quote-unquote communal feast was, of course, based on Yeshua's identity as a lamb. We don't want to take away from that. But then we move forward into the covenant meal. It's clear Paul sees the Lord's Supper, the Last Supper, however you want to describe it, through Jewish eyes as a new Passover. And he saw this communion as a participation in the Last Supper or at the death of Yeshua the Messiah. So the new Passover meal has new manna from heaven, and it has what I would call the new bread of the presence. So if we go back, Exodus 16 talks about the manna being the daily sustenance, what's called the supernatural food that's going to provide for the people. And then the bread of the presence, the manna is on a daily basis. The bread of the presence would serve as a weekly basis, supernatural food. And again, Exodus 16, which obviously follows Exodus 15, but that's the whole triumphant song, the Song of Moshe, Miriam, celebrating the triumph over the Egyptians in the sea. So the defeat of the enemy. That enemy is no more, covered by the waters, sank like lead into the deep. Pharaoh and chariots and armies and all of that. And then here we are, here's the sustenance for them daily to eat as they are moving into the wilderness, and eventually they will travel through the wilderness to the promised land, at which time the manna will stop once they enter into the promised land. But of course, the congregation is not happy, and they are complaining that they've been brought out in the wilderness to be killed with hunger. And God tells them in the morning, you will be filled with the bread. So interesting, this daily bread thing. We go back to Matthew 6:11, which again is centered in the Sermon on the Mount, starting in 5:1. And we're all familiar with the Lord's Prayer, give us this day our daily bread. And Brant Peter talked about this in his book, Jesus and the Jewish Roots of Passover. He explained this. I thought it was really good. So we have like two words. We have daily, give us this day our daily bread. So it's kind of a repetition here. But day is different than daily, apparently, in the Greek. The Greek word epiousios is the word that goes to daily, and it's actually referring to the bread, the artos. So it's a different word, as I said, than day, and it's supposed to be the bread that fills for each day, and that it is the bread that is referring to the manna in the wilderness. So here we have, even in the Lord's Prayer at the Sermon on the Mount, which I think is a Passover narrative there, that we have the idea of the new manna in the wilderness being pointed to. So what Brant Peter said is this is the only occurrence here of this epiousios in ancient Greek literature. It comes straight out of the New Testament. It's originally in the New Testament, so it's not found in some other source to give context to the meaning. And what scholars are saying is that it's basically saying, give us our supernatural bread. The church father Jerome talks about it as supersubstantial bread. So it's a prayer for the supernatural bread that is daily, referring to the manna in the Exodus, and now we see it as a new manna. It says in there to ask first for the new manna, the new bread from heaven in the Lord's Prayer. He is asserting that there's definitely links between the Last Supper and the bread of the presence in this, and the manna. All of these things kind of tied together. So, as I go on to talk about the bread of the presence, which of course is the bread that was we see it in the book of Exodus in 25, and of course in the temple, the bread of the presence, that 12 loaves that are baked. We think unleavened bread, and which the priests would eat, which we'll talk about a little more here. But it's called the bread of the presence. It was always set on the table inside the holy place before God, and it was to be eaten. It didn't just sit there. Again, it was food to be eaten, but it was also offered as a sacrifice, if you will. Along with it was a wine libation that sat next to the bread on the table. And the wine libation was not poured out either, but was drunk in the sacral meal of the bread and the wine for the priests. Recalling again, Moses and the elders saw God while they ate and they drank the bread of the presence, being in the presence of God. That's from Exodus 24:11. The nobles beheld God and ate and drank. So it would appear that this earthly bread, the bread of the presence, was the visible sign of the invisible heavenly face of God, the sign of God's presence. It's supposed to be eaten. To eat it is an act of worship. And I think that Yeshua is comparing his body to be eaten with this bread of the presence with the new manna. And this is all meant to be as an act of worship, we call, and a ratification of the covenant that he has made. So again, the bread of the presence represented a sacred bond between God and the 12 tribes. Aaron and sons ate in the holy place, and you can read about that in Leviticus 24, verses 5 through 7. And it was said to be an eternal or perpetual offering. And the 12, obviously, the 12 cakes of unleavened bread represented each of the 12 tribes. And now in the new bread of the presence, going to represent the 12 disciples. And we have that whole dialogue in John 6, which we'll get into. So the gift of God, of his presence, was a sign of the everlasting covenant. So this is from Menachot, the Babylonian Talmud, Menachot 29a. So we know that at festival time, the priests actually in the temple would remove the golden table on which sat the bread and the wine libation, and they would bring it so that from the holy place, so that the pilgrims or those who have ascended for the festival would be able to see. And it says from the Babylonian Talmud that the priests would lift up and exhibit the presence on it to those who came up for the festivals, saying, "Behold God's love for you." So that's pretty significant about it's being displayed at festival time to the people. And the quote made here that, "Behold God's love for you." So this is the love of God to provide security and sustenance for you, that he would not abandon you and leave you and forsake you. And so on our response to him, to worship and thank and do whatever was necessary as we came into his presence, but him providing the bread of the presence and him expressing love towards his people by providing food. I don't think we really appreciate how difficult it was to actually eat back in the ancient days. What was required, obviously the land had to be worked. You need people to work it. You needed, crops that were going to do well. You needed good weather, all that sort of thing. And they were always worried about scarcity and famine and shortages and starving to death because there are so many factors that would lead to them. So they appreciate food and the importance of being provided with food way more than we do, because we just run down to the store and pick up a loaf of bread without much thought. John 6 is alluding again to both, I think, the new manna and the bread of the presence. When Yeshua is saying, "For the bread of God is the one coming down from heaven and giving life to the world. I am, the great I am," going back to Exodus 3:14. "I am that I am. I will be who I will be. I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me will never hunger or thirst." So imagine saying that, the promise of never hungering and thirsting and being able to feed on this bread. So farther into the chapter, chapter 6 of John, you guys are all familiar with the 5,000, feeding the 5,000 in the wilderness, and how Yeshua multiplied the 5 loaves and the 2 fish. Now, in the temple, looking at the 12 loaves, they would be eaten by the priest, yes, but in particular, the high priest ate 5 loaves. 5 loaves were designated to him and his family. The other 7 loaves were divided up amongst the rest of the priests. So it's kind of interesting, isn't it, that he would use those numbers of 5 loaves there. And it tells us, and it talks about them, they were eating and they were full and they had leftovers. This is an important expression because it's speaking of the leftovers in the bread of the world to come. And actually there's a quote there in Psalm 78, verses 25 through 29, also makes that same expression. They ate, they were full, and had some left over. Another place where we can find this that we have in John 6 about eating, about being satisfied or being full and having leftovers. And of course, we have 12 baskets that are leftovers. And obviously that's connected to the bread of the presence in my mind, the 5 loaves and the 12 left over. So from Ruth 2, which starting verse 14, of course, everything in Ruth takes place between the barley and the wheat harvest, and it's the threshing floor, and it's all about eating. And as Boaz said to her at mealtime, "Come here and eat of the bread Dip your piece of bread in the vinegar. Isn't that interesting? So she sat beside the reapers, and he passed parched grain to her, and she ate, and she was full, and she had some left over. So it's this exact same expression there. So in the Babylonian Talmud from Shabbat 113:5, it says, this is the commentary on the Ruth here, Ruth story. It says, and she ate in this world, and she was full in the days of the Messiah, and she had leftovers in the world to come. So we have this obvious overlay of the kingdom of heaven on earth, and we see this patterned in this world, the days of Messiah, and the world to come. So, and there's, of course, Yeshua doing the same thing. So, and numbers of scholars are comparing the feeding of the 5,000 with the Last Supper. So it's very interesting. I believe Brant Peter did the same thing in his book, Jesus and the Jewish Festivals. It's a great book to get. It's so easy to read. You can read it in an afternoon. But there were a number of comparisons, a number of similarities. Of course, you can read from Mark 6:42, Mark 14:12 through 25 are dealing with the Last Supper and the 5,000. And it says they ate and they were full and they had some left over. And again, the disciples picked up the 12 baskets that were left over, speaking of eating the bread in the world to come by his disciples. So here are just some of the similarities between the Last Supper and the 5,000. Both take place in the evening. You can look through that. Both speak of people reclining. So when we see the reclining language, we immediately think of Passover. We see in the Last Supper that Yeshua and the disciples are reclining. One talks about green grass, and the other is speaking of the Garden of Gethsemane. So we have a little connection there. So they both took the 5 loaves and broke. In both examples, they were blessed. In both examples, Yeshua blessed the bread, broke the bread, and gave thanks. And of course, in the Catholic tradition, they call the giving thanks is the Eucharist. That's the actual translation. So they both gave thanks, and then they gave to the disciples in both examples. So there's this connection then between the Last Supper, the eating of the bread, the 5,000, the food in the world to come. Again, with the focus on expressions of worship as one comes into the divine presence of God. Now, in Matthew 12, verse 8, it tells us that, you're familiar with this, that when King David was hungry, he entered into the house, the tabernacle, and he ate of the bread of the presence, which technically speaking wasn't lawful because technically he wasn't a priest, but he actually was from the Melchizedek priesthood, if you will, going way back, but we don't want to get into that. Bread was not considered common. It was considered holy, the holy bread, the bread of the presence, consecrated bread in the holy place. And again, the bread for the Levites and the bread for the high priest. And so you can read about that in 1 Samuel 21:3. But it also says that David and company, David in particular, when they were in a state of ritual purity, so they could eat. So typically, it says that they hadn't been with women. So typically, celibacy was practiced when they were on a military expedition, or priests when they served in the sanctuary. So David was given the 5 loaves, as was the high priest, to eat on Sabbath. Again, the meal and the offering. The bread of the presence was both a meal and an offering at the same time. So the Last Supper is not just a new Passover, but it is also speaking of a new bread and a new wine of the presence. So it's the Passover, the lamb eaten, it's connected to the manna, but also to the bread of the presence, which is tied to the bread and the wine that are on the table in the holy place. And the bread of the presence and the bread and the wine were signs of the divine presence. The declaration that the institution of this new bread and new wine of the presence signified the bread of Yeshua's own presence. We were seeing the presence of God in Yeshua here. and that these are perpetual signs of his love, that he gave them wine and bread eternally, if you will, saying, "This is my body given for you. This is the blood of the covenant poured out for many." And so early on, many Jewish Christians would have seen the Last Supper as an institution of the new bread of the presence. And of course, what is Yeshua saying about himself? That he is the true temple. He is the place where God dwells on earth, where you can come and eat of the bread of the presence and live forever. So as I mentioned earlier, the Jews believed in the return of the manna at this time. So that's kind of interesting. The old manna that we read about in Exodus 16 communicated a natural life, but where the new manna communicated to them a supernatural life. Again, everything revolved around food and supplying sustenance and food. Now we're speaking of that food needed for an eternal food. So the old manna was a foretaste, if you will, of coming into the promised land. Once they did, the manna stopped, and then they could grow their own food and be involved in the agriculture. And the new manna was a foretaste, if you will, of the bodily resurrection. The idea of the new manna, and probably the bread of the presence, was speaking of resurrection, that he who eats this bread will live forever. That was the idea of a resurrected body. It's that Yeshua wished to give them a resurrected body under the veil of the bread and the wine. If they wanted to enter the new promised land of what we might call new creation in the New Testament, or the world to come, they had to eat the food of the new creation, which is going to be the bread of the world to come, the new manna and the bread of the presence. And again, these are the expressions of worship, where the deity and humanity meet together in a communal meal on a quote-unquote cosmic mountain for mutual act of worship and creation. This is what we're seeing at Mount Sinai with Moses and Aaron and the elders and all, and this act of worship in eating and drinking, and the same thing on the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 5, and also with John chapter 6. That this is the reward. The reward is the rest and shalom and life in Yahweh's divine presence. So the worship language there, Exodus 24, first half of the chapter there, the cutting of the covenant. Behold the blood of the covenant, linking, I think, the creation of a new community in the New Testament, this new creation community after the creation itself. So the meeting place of man with God on the mountain, the place of a covenantal blessing and worship, to the sacral and communal meals that are eaten. And these meals were generally eaten after a victory that a divine warrior had. I don't want to get into the whole divine warrior language, but typical of what would happen is once the divine warrior defeated the enemy, he was given a temple. That temple was built. He would take his place on the throne in the temple, and then there would be great celebration with a meal for everyone to participate. So the meal always followed a victory, and we certainly see that in the Exodus story, right? As they do eat a meal, they go through the water, they eat the Passover lamb, and then later eat the meal on the mountain with the bread and the wine. So that meal of wine and bread confirms, ratifies, concludes the covenant. So eating the bread and drinking the wine are part of the new Passover. The Last Supper, the last Passover, not just a memorial, but an instituting of the new Passover, to eat the bread of the presence. This is the idea of ritual worship in this context of the covenant, the idea of mediating as Yeshua do, as Moses did, the relationship between God and his people, and the creation in all this of what I would consider to be the covenant community. And I think all of this really is supposed to take place within the context of the community. It's not just you going out and eating some bread, but that as a community, because we see that in Acts, right? In the early chapters of Acts, that they, gathered together to eat, to break bread and eat in homes, eating of the new Passover, the new manna, the wine, the manna, and the bread of the presence. And so this idea of the communion between God and his people. And, as Moshe calls the people to draw near, so too Yeshua drawing near to his presence, where the divine presence dwells in him. And so Passover is speaking of a new covenant community, and the call is to draw near. It's synonymous with the growing covenant community. So that's just a little bit of a different look, I guess, for Passover this year. I wanted to see it with new eyes, to try to better understand it through the eyes of the New Testament and what's really going on there. So this Passover, I hope you'll spend a little time thinking about worship and coming into the presence of God, and seeing that the bread of the presence and the new manna as part of the meal. And I'm not, I should say, I haven't spent very much time here talking about the lamb. That's like a whole nother topic. So this was, the idea here was just to really focus in on the bread of the presence. So thanks for joining me, and I will see you next time somewhere, somehow. And Hag Sameach.